Good morning. We'll start our topic, Wordsworth's conception of poetry. The next point we'll be discussing is the true function of poetry. According to Wordsworth, the true function of poetry in the preface, as he discusses, is to give pleasure. Even when the subject is painful, it must be treated in a way that its main result is to give overplus of pleasure. The poet himself should be in a state of enjoyment, and it is his duty to communicate his own enjoyment to his readers. But pleasure is not the only and the main aim of poetry. Its aim is more exalted and noble. Poetry is not mere entertainment, it is but a diversion of patrons' idle hours like rope dancing and such sort of things that we do in our idle moments. To be incapable of a feeling for poetry in the true sense of the word is to be without love of human nature and reverence for God. So its mission is to arouse the sensual from their sleep of death and win the vacant in the vain to noble raptures. Therefore, poetry, to be worth any name, must serve the purpose of life and morality. Poetry divorced from morality is valueless. Through his own poetry, Wordsworth hoped to console the afflicted, to add sunshine to daylight by making the happy happier, to lead the young and the gracious of every age to see, to think, and to feel, and therefore to become more actively and securely virtuous. The next point is the poet, his nature and gifts. Excuse me. Equally exalted in his conception of the nature of a poet is not an ordinary individual or an ordinary human being. He is a man endowed with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness, who has a greater knowledge of human nature and a more comprehensive soul than are supposed to be common among mankind. Sensibility is the great birthright of all, but in most of us it is gradually overlaid by a weight of custom or choked by the daily worries of our world. The poet keeps his sensibility, his capacity to feel and perceive, fresh and unimpaired. But his sensibility alone would not make him a poet, for there are many other gifted natures or gifted gifts which he should procure to become a poet. Quote, the vision and the faculty divine, yet wanting the accomplishment of verse. Unquote. Therefore, we can say that the poet differs from other natures, even from other poetic natures, for he is articulate. He can communicate his experiences and communicate them in a way as to give pleasure. So, Wordsworth says about his sister what she did for him. Quote, she gave me eyes, she gave me ears, and humble cares, and delicate fears, and love and hope and joy. Unquote. Therefore, the poet himself has more than usual capacity to perceive and feel, and he increases this capacity in others through his poetry. Next is the themes of poetry. So, what should be the subject of a poetry? Of course, any subject between heaven and earth can be treated in poetic manner, but Wordsworth preferred incidents and situations that are taken from low and rustic life. He made the women of Cumberland, their lives and characters and everyday objects of nature, the subjects of his poetry, because in that condition of life the elementary passions and emotions find a clear and free expression. They can be observed more clearly and expressed more accurately. Moreover, such elementary passions in rural conditions are associated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. Means they are unspoiled part of nature because they are far from the city life. The poet therefore must deal with such simple and subjects, but a certain coloring of imagination should be there, whereby ordinary things should be presented in a way that mind takes the mind in an unusual way. The mental process by which this aim is achieved we have already discussed. It should also be noted that for Wordsworth it is the feeling and emotion that is important and not the action and situation. Feeling developed in a poem gives importance to the action and situation and not the action and situation to the feeling. Next is the language of poetry. Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction was a direct outcome of his democratic preference for simple and rustic life and characters. Therefore, it can be said that his language was also influenced by this sort of life. When the theme was simple, the language should also be simple. It must be a selection of the language that is really spoken by such men, otherwise it would not be in the character. He is critical of the artificial poetic diction of 18th century poetry and goes to the extent of saying that there is no essential difference between the language of prose and poetry. So, to sum up the main points of the preface, we can say that number one, the preface to the 1802 edition of the lyrical ballads is of great significance, for it gives us a expression of Wordsworth's views on the nature and function of poetry and the nature of a poet. Number two, in the preface he speaks of poetry both as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and passion, and also as emotions recollected in tranquility. So, when the poet speaks of poetry as spontaneous overflow of powerful passions, he means that poetry is a matter of the heart and not of the mind. It is not an intellectual process, it is not craft but inspiration. So, it cannot be written on order, but it can be created voluntarily by the poet when he has that mood or he has that feeling to write something. Number four, we can say that it is an expression of emotions recollected in tranquility. The poet does not express his feelings immediately but allows sufficient time to elapse, and during this interval he thinks and ponders over his emotions. The creation takes place through four clearly marked stages. Number one, the perception of some object which produces powerful emotions. Then number two, the recollection of that emotion in tranquility, in which memory plays a very important role. Number three, the setting up of or revival of the original emotion through interrogation of the memory. In this process, the original emotion may be purged of all superfluities and may be more enjoyable. Therefore, this produces an overplus of pleasure. And number four, the communication of this pleasure to the readers, and the poet uses meter because meter adds pleasure to the piece of poetry. Therefore, the act of poetic creation is not a tranquil one. The poet is agitated by this act. Wordsworth closely himself follows his theory in practice. He allowed sufficient time to elapse before he gave poetic expression to his emotions. And the next point is that poetry must give pleasure, but it has other ends as well. It must also serve the purpose of life and morality. It must answer the question how to live and make the men nobler and better. Wordsworth had an exalted conception of his own calling. The poet has greater organic sensibility than others, and while others lose their sensibility, the poet retains it. And moreover, he is articulate and he can convey his experiences to others. The poet should prefer subjects taken from humble and rustic life for poetry. And we can see this in all of Wordsworth's poetry, as he says that simple subjects can have a greater impact. And the diction of poetry must also be simple, as in keeping with its simple and rustic themes. It should be a selection of language that is really spoken by men or really used by men. So this was a gist of the topic that we had discussed, that is Wordsworth's conception of poetry. Thank you.